Swan House is one of the historic houses at the Atlanta History Center. We have 4 total on 33 acres of gardens, of which Sarah is in charge, and a museum with 14 galleries located on our site altogether. So a research center and many other facilities. What we're going to be talking about this evening is Swan House. The History Center is actually located on the estate where the house was built. And as much as anything else, we're going to be talking about the people who made this possible. That's Emily Inman, Ruby Ross Wood, and Philip Schutze. That was the owner who had the house built, the decorator, and the architect. They were all from Georgia. By the time the house was built, Ruby Ross Wood, the decorator, was working in New York. They were all each strong-willed, independent, uncompromising, and argumentative, egotistical, and only imagine what those meetings were like when they were all working together.
Kind of like our staff meetings.
But I want to give some background to that first. So I know that we're working in the roaring 20s. So Atlanta in the 20s, welcome to Atlanta. Welcome South, brother, they used to say. Those of you who are in the Northeast may think that Atlanta is a sleepy little backwater. Actually a vibrant and exciting city. It was the largest metropolis in the Southeast at that point in time. In the middle of the 20s, the Chamber of Commerce launched a campaign, a branding opportunity, as it were, to advertise the city to the rest of the nation. It was called Forward Atlanta. And by the end of it, over 750 companies had moved to Atlanta, as it's infusing $34 million into the payroll. And so Atlanta was really on the move in the 20s. It was an important city in the Southeast. A lot of building was going on. We are in a building boom right now, I can tell you, in Atlanta, that seems nonstop. They were in the 20s as well. So the English American building was finished in 1897. A lot of building after that. Our Flatiron actually preceded New York's by 5 years. This is Peachtree Street. I think you're all aware of that. This area here is what's called Upper Peachtree. It was a residential area in much of the 19th century, but you can see now it's part of a thriving metropolis. The building on the right-hand side is the Howard Theater, and the Howard Theater was completed in 1924, and the architects of that was, hence Reed and Adler, which is the firm that built the Swan House as well. 5 Points in Atlanta was the center of the city. It was 1 block from the railroad depot. And you can, even at this point in time, there are horse and mule-drawn carriages that are coming through, as well as automobiles and trolley cars. Atlanta was also a financial center. Federal Reserve Bank was located here, as well as a lot of hotels. And the building here that I'm pointing to was the Davis and Paxson department store that was also a job of Hence Reed and Adler, on which Philip Schutze worked. That's still there. It was Macy's department store for a number of years. Atlanta also is important for its collection of historic Black colleges and universities. This is on the west side of town, and it shows Spelman, Morris Brown, Morehouse, Clark University, and Atlanta University as well, all of which were African-American educational academic facilities. But Atlanta was founded as a railroad town in 1837. This is Terminal Station. By 1920s, Terminal Station was serving almost 100 trains per day. Wow. 8-way to the south. But at the same time, the automobile was changing in Atlanta. This is the Auto Speedway, the Candler Speedway. And within just a few years, it actually became the site of the Atlanta airport, which is now the busiest airport in the world, in 1926. We're talking about residential Atlanta. And so Peachtree Street in early Atlanta served as the main residential area. Columned homes, it was also the site for the governor's mansion. Much of Peachtree Street, Upper Peachtree Street was tree lined. It was all very inviting. Just south of the downtown area was Washington Street, which was another residential area. And after the turn of the century, Frederick Law Olmsted was involved in developing Druid Hills, which was one of the first suburban areas in Atlanta. In Atlanta, the Georgian Terrace was built on the edge of Atlanta on the northern side. That is because, and if you can see up here at the top, where it talks about the Collier line, all of the property north of this area, this is Midtown Atlanta, this is Peachtree Street coming up through here, was owned by one man by the name of George Washington Collier, and he would not sell. And so there was no development north of the city. And when he died in 1903, they said the Great Wall of Collier had collapsed. And what that led to was a north side of town called Ansley Park. And you can see some clearing of Ansley Park here. The reason I'm even talking about this is because this is where Edward and Emily Inman built their first home before Swan House. Emily Caroline Mcdougall was born in Columbus, Georgia in 1881 to a prominent family. She married Edward Hamilton Inman. He was also born in 1881 in Atlanta, and he was a son of Hugh Inman, who at the time of his death, Hugh Inman, his father, was listed as the wealthiest man in Georgia. The Inmans were involved in a wide variety of commercial efforts, banking, transportation, railroads, merchandise, all of which is primarily related to the cotton industry. They moved to Atlanta shortly after the Civil War from Eastern Tennessee as cotton brokers. I also wanted to be sure and mention Emily Fitton Mcdougall, who was Emily Caroline Mcdougall Inman's mother, because she was so influential on Emily. I think you can tell from her portrait that she's a very powerful and opinionated woman as well. Widowed early, she took command of the family and ran her own business, moved her family to Atlanta from Columbus, Georgia, and became a prominent suffragist fighting for the vote for women. She was the head of the women's suffrage in the state of Georgia for a number of years. Emily Mcdougall and Edward Inman met fairly young. They were married at the age of 20 in 1901 at her parent or her grandparents' house in downtown Atlanta. You can tell from this photo that she's also a strong-willed woman. She liked to travel and she liked to shop. And this is Edward Inman, again from a prominent family. When they were married, they moved into his father's house on Peachtree Street and lived there for a number of years. Emily was very well educated and very knowledgeable in the arts and also in architecture. So her husband allowed her to build a house. And that first house was built in Ansley Park. In 1909, they commissioned a Tudor-style house, which was completed. They moved in. Within a few years, Emily hired Edward Dougherty to renovate and expand the house. They added an addition to the back of the house, being a master bedroom on the top floor, and on the bottom floor, a larger living room. Within just a short period of time, they also hired the firm of Hentz, Reed and Adler for a significant interior renovation of the house. This included paneling and decorative elements throughout the first floor public rooms. The final plans were completed in 1920. What this doesn't indicate, but it's actually on the plans that we have here at the History Center, is the fact that the job information is listed as Mrs. Inman's house, not as Mr. Inman's house. So she was very much driving the renovation of this. Shortly after the renovation was finished, the photographers Tebbs and Nell came down from New York to document the house. They were known as the photographers to architects and decorators. And when we came across these photos in our collection, came in just a number of years ago, we were very excited because we did not know this house had been documented. One of the reasons it's so exciting is because there's so much of furnishings that are in this house that are also in Swan House today. So the overmantel that you see here is in the current house and was actually the inspiration for Schutze for the decoration of the library in Swan House. This is the library. And you can see that some of the original plans for the decoration include a great deal of swags, and this is all plaster work that was included. You can see it here, it's included in the dining room, which also shows the details for the fireplace. I can tell you that there are many furnishings that are in this photograph that are in Swan House today. And again, some of the architectural renderings that we have for this is the over the doorway hand carving that was included in this house in Ansley Park, which is in the Midtown area of Atlanta. It's about 10 miles from downtown. And this was the Great Hall in that house. You'll recognize this particular painting later on when we get to Swan House. This is an interesting room. I think that this probably shows more of the decorative design of Ruby Ross Wood, who also decorated this house, than it does possibly of Mrs. Inman. But again, this is the house that was primarily the idea of Mrs. Inman. The decorator was Ruby Ross Wood, who was actually a friend of Mrs. Inman's. They had gone to school together. And the architectural firm, again, was Hens, Reed & Adler, which was the preeminent firm in Atlanta. Well, not long after the house was built, so in 1924, in May of 1924, there was damage done to the house. The third floor burned, the roof collapsed, and we moved into the Biltmore Hotel. Taking half of a floor, they lived there as Emily planned her new home, which became Swan House. Interesting that House and Garden's second book of interiors included those photographs from Tebbs Nell in that publication. And one of the interesting things about this is it tells us, despite the fact that these are black and white photos, it tells us about some of the color choices, probably decisions that were prompted by Ruby Ross Wood. The hallway cabinets in the upper photograph were blue and gold. The dining room walls that you see in the lower left-hand corner were sky blue, and the dining rug and the curtains were lemon yellow. The library curtains were blue, sapphire blue satin. The library furniture was covered in red damask and chintz. And on the lower right-hand side, the hall room cabinet is red lacquer. So at this point in time, neither Mrs. Inman nor Mrs. Wood had any hesitation to use bright colors. Later on, when we look at a particular room in Swan House. But I wanted to also give some background to Ruby Ross Wood. She was born in Monticello, Monticello is how you pronounce that, Monticello, Georgia in 1881. She started out as a reporter for the Atlanta newspapers. She was involved in society events. And as I say, she was a friend of Mrs. Inman before she went to New York. Going to New York, a journalist first, and it was that which actually led to her working as a decorator. And I want to share a quote from something that was published by Mitchell Owens, who at one point was the decorative arts editor for Architecture Digest. And he writes, Ruby Ross Wood was an anomaly when compared with other prominent decorators of her day. She was not a charter member of the international social set like Elsie de Wolfe. She was not a beautiful society divorcee like Dorothy Draper. And she was decidedly not a glamorous kept woman like Rose Cumming. Instead, Ruby Ross Wood, chain smoking, impatient, hard-tongued, was what used to be called a working girl. She was self-made in many ways. And I think she would be she's one of those people that when they ask you if you could ever have dinner with anybody from the past, who would it be? I think Ruby would be very entertaining. It's interesting that she was hired because she was a journalist. She was hired by Theodore Dreiser, who was an author, but also the publisher of a magazine called The Delineator. And he hired her to take the decorative arts, or the decorative lectures that Elsie de Wolfe had given at the Colony Club and turn those into articles because Elsie was not good at writing. So that's what she did. So Ruby turned those into a series of articles that appeared in The Delineator. They reworked them for Ladies in Germany, and then they reworked them again and published them as The House in Good Taste, 1913. Ross Wood was the ghostwriter for those articles. That was, this is the beginning of interior decorating. It was a revolutionary publication of its time. Shortly after that, Ruby Ross Goodnow, which was her married name, published her own book called The Honest House. It's full of great information and advice. Beautiful. Well, that is a word that holds its own meaning for each of us. There isn't a better word if you apply it honestly. It's always looking for the truth in beauty. Everyone needs to be honest to themselves to have a comfortable home. And one of the things that she spoke about the most was that we can all have fundamentally good taste if we look for comfort in our home. She was a major proponent of eclectic design. As she says here, I'm not one of those painstakingly careful people who would have you throw away good furniture just to keep a room in period. So she was always looking to mix time periods and styles in order to achieve the final effect. She used bright and colorful wallpaper, always understanding that the furniture and hangings that accompany it must match its character. She also used bold colors in the home. That's probably most prevalent in a room that she did for herself, in which it was a shade of red. She, at this point, she is married to Chalmers Wood, who was a stockbroker. And so she was very much New York society at this point in time. They had an apartment on Park Avenue, and she would decorate the apartment, live in it for a year, then sell it. She was a flipper of her time. And then she would move into another apartment, decorate it, and sell that. After World War II, she discovered the fabrics of Paul Merot from Paris, again, very bright and bold, and she used these in her final years. She died in 1950 of cancer, but she was known for bold color choices and welcoming spaces. This is the apartment that she did for, oh, sorry, gone blank. But it was considered the definition of timeless chic. Brooke Astor, sorry. But perhaps the thing we should talk about most is her own house called Little Ipswich. She was developing this house at the same time that she was working on Swan. And there are many aspects of this that match Swan House. The entrance to the house was a round foyer. It had a black and white floor, and it also had swans in the ceiling. The living room, again, was very eclectic. It had antiques, but it also had all the seating furniture was contemporary. Part of the living room again, and you can see again, it's kind of a mix and match of styles and periods. The sofa here is red, and we'll see it again. Library, there's a swan rug on the floor. Another scene of the library, and it's a swan rug on the floor again. The colors in this room are very much a deep red, golden yellow, and then the warm tones of the wood. Her bedroom included swan rug on the floor. The final judgment in decorating is not the logic with the mind, however, the logic from the eye. So she was publishing, in addition to what she'd already done with her book, she published in Vogue magazine throughout the 30s and 40s. This really made her the preeminent decorator of the 30s and 40s because she was so well published and so well known. She was working in New York and she was working in Palm Beach. Probably her most famous quote is this one: "Decorating is the art of arranging things comfortably." And isn't that a great thing to say? I wanted to include this one because of the Coromandel screens, because they were a bit of a signature item for her. And we'll see those in Swan House as well. Which then brings us to Swan House. For a number of years, it wasn't clear exactly what she had done in Swan House because there are no records related to that. But we do have this. This is one of the job cards that we have from the firm Hensreid and Adler, because we have the architectural records here at the Atlanta History Center. And if you notice down at the bottom, one set, and what those different plans are the floor plans and the wall elevations for all of the public rooms downstairs in Swan House. And you'll notice it says, Mr. Schutze for Mrs. Wood for interior decorating. That was our first real clue years ago that she actually did work in Swan House. I think this is a great shot. She is the one that's sitting down, and I'm sorry she's at this this cocktail party. She looks a little preoccupied and bored to me. And I love this photo. This is my favorite of her. It's such a quiet, contemplative shot of her working at home. And I think that's very much of what she was like. If she was bored in the last shot, it's probably because she had better things to do. I don't know. I just find this such a charming, wonderful photograph of her at her home at Little Ipswich. The work that has been done on her has really been done over the last 10 years, and it was very much prompted by this particular book. And so if you're interested, I would definitely suggest getting a copy of this book, The Great Lady Decorators, by Adam Lewis. I hope I'm not giving too much deep background here. I wanted to talk about Buckhead, which is where the Swan House is located, and J. Neil Reed, who was one of the founding partners of the Hence, Reed and Adler firm, and who had an important impact on residential architecture in Atlanta. Buckhead, very much at that point in time, was the country. It was originally founded in the 1830s. Just to give a little background, because this tavern that you see was the tavern of Henry Irby, and it was known as Irbyville at that point in time, until somebody shot a buck. And believe it or not, we think this is actually a rifle that was used, and the man that probably shot the buck, the buck's head was placed on a pole next to that tavern, which is just up the road from the Atlanta History Center. That's how Buckhead got its name. It's kind of like the development of Ansley Park that I was talking about earlier. The area of Buckhead was also an area which was, the land was owned by, believe it or not, George Collier's brother, Wesley Collier, and he didn't sell until he died, after he died. And then about 500 acres were opened up. This was very much the country, as it were, outside Atlanta. And as Sarah can also tell you, this is the country place era. And all of a sudden, this became a place for great country estates, for the wealthy of Atlanta to build their homes. This is really the first one, Woodhaven, which was the Maddox House. And Robert Maddox had been the mayor of Atlanta at one point in time. It was built in 1911, and it is the first of the great country houses that was built on West Paces Ferry Road in Atlanta on 73 acres of land. The architects that really became prominent in designing these houses in Buckhead was originally founded as Norman Henson Reed in 1909. This is Joseph Neil Reed actually on the right, and Hal Hence on the left were founding partners. Godfrey Norman was an established architect in Atlanta who passed away shortly after the company was founded. This is the photograph of the two, Hal Hence and Neil Reed, at the country estate Hills and Dales in 1916. This is Neil Reed. He was born in Jacksonville, Alabama. This is that house, Hills and Dales, the Callaway House, built in LaGrange, Georgia. And as Sarah can tell you, it is overlooking a fabulous set of gardens that were established by Sarah Farrell in 1841. And like the other country estates, there was always a garden plan that went with these, with the firm of Hence, Reed and Adler. And Schutze would continue that as well after he came to the firm. I just want to share some of the architecture that they built in Atlanta. And all of these are located probably about within a mile of the Atlanta History Center. The Arden House on West Paces Ferry Road. This is the Della Manta Apartments, which is closer downtown in Midtown. This is actually the apartment building that Margaret Mitchell was living in when she died in 1949. The Case House. You can see that there's a wide variety of architectural styles that the firm is using. This is the Willis Jones House. This was actually the headquarters for the Atlanta History Center for a time. And afterward, it was moved from the Brookwood neighborhood, which is in Midtown, to Buckhead. So it was moved probably about 7 miles. You can imagine this house actually being moved. The Draper House, which is on Cherokee Road. There are a number of Hence, Reed and Adler houses on Cherokee Road, which is just a few blocks from the Atlanta History Center. This one as well. I just want you to get an idea of the types of homes that were being built here by this firm at this point in time. All of this is in the 20s. This is in Midtown. It's actually an apartment building, so they were doing commercial buildings as well. It's now known as the Reed House in Neil Reed's honor. This is the Nixon House, which is actually adjoins the property of the Atlanta History Center. Interesting about this house was completed in 1925. It's the last house that Neil Reed supervised personally. And they also did what you might consider to be Southern mansions as well. This is located outside Atlanta in Mansfield, Georgia. This is an interesting building because it shows Italian influence. And by this point, Philip Schutze was working with the firm. And we're into a gray area here, considering what did Neil Reed do and what did Philip Schutze do? Because Neil Reed was very much the driving force of the architectural firm in much of the design of the building. Which leads us to Swan House, because it's actually, I said that the Nixon House was the last one he supervised. Swan House, the Inman House, was the last house he actually worked on. His partner said Reed was a genius with beauty dripping from his fingertips. Was very much the way everybody felt about him at the time. In 1923, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor. One operation, and it was inoperable. And so he died in 1926. This monument in Rose Hill Cemetery in Macon, Georgia, was actually designed by his dear friend, Philip Schutze. Again, if you're interested in him, there's a great book by William R. Mitchell on the work of Neil Reed. So there's a period here where Neil Reed and Philip Schutze are overlapping. Philip Schutze was born in Columbus, Georgia. He went to Georgia Tech. He was in the first graduating class of architecture at Georgia Tech. He won the Rome Prize in 1915 and was able to study in Italy, based in Rome. It's just him in Italy. Very involved in taking very specific measurements of buildings in Rome, Siena, Florence, throughout northern Italy. And you can see that his talent as an artist came into play here in these very detailed drawings that he was executing while he was in Italy. One of the places that he went to was Villa Corsini. This is the fountain at Villa Corsini. Remember the look of this, and remember those urns at the top of their retaining wall. I shared this photograph with Sarah a couple of days ago, and she thought it was an old photograph of Swan House. So that I was thrilled to know that. This is the retaining wall at Villa Corsini. If you see the figure sitting up sketching, that's Philip Schutze. And again, recognize or remember these urns. This is him in Italy in 1917. It was World War II. He worked for the Red Cross at one point in time, driving ambulances in World War I. So he was there for about 5 years, going back and forth. His studies were interrupted by World War I. When he came back, you can see that he was very involved in bringing Italian architecture of the Renaissance and the Baroque to Atlanta. He actually, after he got back to New York, he had actually had lunch with Ruby Ross Wood one day. And she wrote in her journal afterward that he was mad about the Baroque. These are interiors, again, just to share some of the work that he did. It's amazing what the architecture that he brought to Atlanta at this point in time. Just again, a sampling of some of the architecture that he worked on. Residential, this is the Calhoun House called Tryggveson. The English House, which is not far away. The Woodroom House. So again, working in a variety of architectural styles. This is an interesting house, Patterson car house. This is actually designed as a farmhouse that has been added onto over time. It's a very interesting concept. It's a beautiful house. This is actually located in Macon, and I wanted to share this one because of the color. It is this sort of aged pink, right? Stucco. A beautiful house. This is Schutze in his later years. He was very much involved at the Atlanta History Center after the History Center acquired Swan House. This is the last portrait that was taken of him. He's posing outside Swan House. And he did tell some of his friends that this was his favorite portrait that had ever been taken of him, which is endearing for us. This is the book on Schutze, American Classicist. This is the edition that has Swan House on the cover. It's actually in its third printing. The one on the left is the first printing that shows the Calhoun House. The one on the right is the Goodrum House. And I think the one on the right would be the one that's currently available. And I hate to take up so much time, but I wanted to talk about Tryggveson. This is a very important house. It is revolutionary in Atlanta residential architecture because Atlanta had never seen anything like this. This is so Philip Schutze because he was mad about the Baroque. It's based on Villa Gori in Siena. He developed the site plan, very detailed. This is the front elevation of the house. The pool out front was a reflecting pool, but it was used by the kids as a swimming pool. Back of the house. And I use the back of the house as an example of something that he did here. The walls, when the stucco on the walls were still wet, he had workers that had burlap bags filled with brick dust, and they beat the walls with the brick dust to add the coloring. And what they did was they acted in a way so that the bottom of the walls would look sun bleached over time. He was trying to achieve the effect of a centuries old Italian villa. The interiors, he always did sketches for the interiors as well. The plasterwork in this house is amazing. But I'm not sure that the Calhouns knew what to do with it because they filled it with their Victorian furniture. They didn't have Ruby Ross wood. The garden design as well. This is probably one of the most, probably the most realized vision of Schutze's when it comes to the exterior, interior, and the gardens of a residence. And on the left is a period photograph, and on the right is one that was taken a few years ago. These are the gate piers that he designed for this house. You see them after the house was completed. This is where they still stand today. The house, however, that view is gone. The property was sold years later. The house is still there, but it has become a development, and the road leading to the house now turns and goes around the house. You don't have that vista of the house anymore, but the house is still there. I want to touch on another one, the Pink Palace, which was also one of those. This house was colored pink in such a way as the Calhoun house was in sort of an orange, but now you can see what someone has done to it. It was painted gray at one point in time. Then it was painted this, I see Sarah's, this sickly sort of color, long, very long, narrow lot. The beautiful house. It was based on this school that's to the left of the church. This is in Venice, and you can see the that it should have been. The interiors were wonderful too. This is a photograph of the interior that was taken not too long ago. And this is the house today. It was bought by a developer who has promised not to tear the house down and promised to return it to its original color. This is not the right color, but it's, at least the house is still standing. So getting to Swan House in 1928, this is the house that we're talking about. And the garden facade is probably the most recognized image in Atlanta. The house is also known for its interiors. These are the Swan Tables that are in the dining room. The beauty of the setting, the design of Schutze. This is the signature blue door, we say, of and I have a blue door on my house now. So the gardens are wonderful. We now have a nice set of cars to go with the house. This is actually the entrance of the house, which is kind of the back of the house. It's similar to what was done with the Calhoun house, because you saw the garden facade from the street, but the actual entrance is around, quote unquote, the back of the house. But it's a beautiful setting. The original plan for Swan House was very large, and this is it. It was a massive two-story building. And these are the floor plans. This is the entrance facade of it. And it originally had a square entrance hallway with the stairs leading up directly from the entrance door. These were the plans that Neil Reed was working on when he was terminally ill and was unable to finish the project. The second floor plan. The inspiration was Bramham Park in England. The only thing that really remains from that is the staircase, horseshoe staircase on the front of that house. And if you look at the triple arched basement of the other side of the house, you'll see that again on a retaining wall at the back of Swan House. Well, Mr. Inman said, it's too big, it's too grand, it looks like Versailles, I don't want it, I'm not gonna pay for it. So they took a step back, and the firm replanned, and this is the point where Schutze really takes over the design of the house. This shows the setting of the house from Andrews Drive to the side of the house up above. This was the design that Schutze came up with. Italian Baroque on one side of the house. He also did sketches for all of the interiors. A detail, and you'll notice the swan at the top of this capital. Again, this is the garden facade. This is the English Palladian side of the house, inspired by William Kent. And it's a smaller house in that the second floor has been reduced in size. But what he's also done is he's taken that square entrance hall and turned it into a round entrance hall and put the stair at the front of the house, as it were, and it becomes a circular staircase rather than a rectangular one. The design for the entrance hall becomes black and white marble with a star in the center. We do not know if that's his design, if that was inspired discussions with Ruby Ross Wood, or how that evolved, but you can see the connection between the two. And then this is the second floor plan where the bedrooms are located. And this is just a detail of that stair in Swan House. The inspiration somewhat for the the Doric side of the house is Duncombe Park in Yorkshire. Schutze once said that the inspiration for swans for Mrs. Inman was the Honda room at Belton House in Lincolnshire. I'm not sure about a dead swan being an inspiration, but that's what he mentioned. There are other swan paintings as well. But one thing I'd like to point out about this particular room is the color of this room. The green with sort of accents in a goldish color over on the sides. And the other two paintings that are in this room by Honda do include swans. Another inspiration that Schutze mentioned in regards to the swans is the swan drawing room at Welbeck Abbey in Nottinghamshire. This rug is very similar to some of the rugs that Mrs. Wood had in her home at Ipswich. In 1931, the New York firm of Tebbs-Nell again came to Atlanta and documented now what is the Inman House. The Inmans never called it actually Swan House. That is something that came after the Atlanta History Center took over possession of the house. But I did want to share these because this is the house. The first documentation we have of the house is the dining room, that entrance hall. This is what was called the morning room, or the family called it the green room. These are all the entrance facade of the house. This is the main stair hall. The garden facade. This is the library. This is the boxwood garden. The entrance hall looking into the main stair hall with the circular staircase and the gardens. Notice those urns again are so similar to what was at Villa Corsini. And then this is the garden facade with the cascade, very similar to Villa Corsini. And probably the grandest room of the house, which is the dining room. And this is Mrs. Inman's bedroom. One thing I want to mention is the fact that you see all that grandeur, as it were, in the house. It was actually a family that was living there. Tragically, they moved in 1928, and tragically, Mr. Inman died 3 years later. Mrs. Inman lived there until 1965. But shortly after her husband passed away, she asked one of her sons, his wife, and their children to move into the house to share it with him. And they did that. So 2 of these children grew up in that house. Unfortunately, the child on the right died shortly after this photograph was taken, and before the family moved into the house. That's Hugh here. This is Sam, and this is Mimi. Sam and Mimi grew up in the house. This is their nanny, Lizzie Pope. This is Mildred Inman, who is the daughter-in-law of Emily Inman. They had bulldogs. These are the kids playing outside the house. That's Sam, who talked about years later how great it was to grow up in that house and in the quarry garden, which is on the property. And he used to roller skate around the house. So the entrance facade, this is it today. The approach is from this side of the house. This is Schutze's plan for the court. The retaining wall, which is opposite the house. And again, if you can think of the Bramah Park that I was talking about earlier, it's very similar sort of design to that. The entrance door, again, to point out the swan above the doorway. This is the urn in an arch that he posed next to have that photograph taken. There's the swan. You can see it a little more clearly there. And an interesting use of shells and other sea or nautical design that's included in the house. And the wall from this gives you an idea of that aspect of the rear courtyard. And in the distance is actually our museum building. We also have a Model T. The Model T is the car that the kids learned how to drive by one of the groundsmen at the house. So moving into the house, you have the interior of the fan light that shows the design. This is looking into the main stair hall. This is looking into the breakfast room. Again, the design of the floor with the black and white marble and the star, and this interesting wave motif that has been included. Schutze also designed the radiator grills in the floor so that they would match the design of the floor, so they would be fairly hidden from view. And now I just want to share some photos that you can see some of the detailing in the work that's been done here. All of the door and window surrounds are all hand-carved wood. And all of the other work in the house is plasterwork. And I think this is an interesting pickup of this rope design, and I'm not sure if that's supposed to carry on the nautical aspect. The chandelier in that opening, and it's always pointed out that there's a bit of a swan's neck included in that. Again, Schutze's design for that space. You can see his original design for the space didn't include that wave aspect, came later. And also original elevation for the doorway, which doesn't show a swan in the fan light, it shows a sunrise. So it's interesting as to where that came about. Just more of the detail work, which is throughout the house. The breakfast room, which is off of the entrance hall, is a clear indication of one of Ruby Ross Wood's favorite design features, and that is what I was speaking about of her own house, which is the use of yellow, a dark burgundy red as the color scheme, and what we would refer to as brown furniture, right? But also the mixing of styles. So you have French Rococo sconces, but you have Regency period furniture. Schutze's original plan sketch for the room. The chandelier actually comes from for the Ansley Park house. And they had a pair of these, and the other one was at their Lake Toxaway house in North Carolina. But again, it's a matching of styles and periods. This particular collection of Chinese export and English porcelain is from the Schutze collection. Schutze himself had a large collection of ceramics, which came to the History Center after he passed away. Most of Mrs. Inman's large porcelain collection of her own was distributed through the family. Although this is something that she owned herself that came back to the History Center. The drapes in this room have been changed over time, but they were selected to match in color and period to what was there originally. Mrs. Inman replaced some textiles and some other things in the 1950s because they were getting worn and faded. And just between the entrance hall and the breakfast room is the gentleman's comfort station. The ladies' comfort station is on the other side of the hall. but very discreetly built into the house. So the stair hall is really the grand aspect of the house. That's looking into the dining room. The tables are Scottish pine and were probably gilded at one point in time. You see the coromandel screen, which is very much a Ruby Ross wood aspect. You see the painting on the wall, which you'll probably recognize from the Annesley Park home, and may in one sense be an inspiration for the sort of nautical aspect in some of the design work. The chairs are English, about 1830. This is the doorway that leads out to the garden facade of the house. It leads into the library. And you can see the amount of detail and architectural work that goes into the first floor of the house. And so I just wanted to share, I'll go through these fairly quickly, some of the woodwork and the different design that goes into the house. The marble is Italian marble, and it was created by Italian craftsmen, and so tightly in Italy, shipped to the US, so tightly fitted that the grout is almost imperceptible. The iron or bronze work was all hand done. And then this is looking up to through the stairwell. The ceilings on the first floor are 15 feet. They're 13 feet on the second floor. This is actually 30 feet up from in the stairwell. This is the view from the garden facade looking down the lawn. And I think you can see on the edge, bottom edge of the stair, you can see that sort of nautical wave appearing again. Looking up from the first floor, the stairwell to the blind windows that are up on the second floor. All of this is all plaster work that was done, and you can see that the balustrade, the banister, carries through all the way up through the second floor. And rosettes are something else that appear. This is underneath the windows that are on the second floor at the garden facade of the house. And Schutze's plan for the stairwell. So I think you'll see it. There's a certain architectural tension going on here. That the blocks of the marble floor, the rectilinear aspect of the architecture of the room, but throughout there's this feeling of C curves, of movement, of shape, the shape of the stairs, the shape of the carvings on this table, that sort of like wave aspect, shells. There's a rounding in the elements as well. And again, this may have been an inspiration for that. Looking into the dining room, looking into the morning room, or what the family called the green room, details of the overdoor with the broken pediments, Dresden china. Looking into the library, the yellow room on the left is the telephone closet. the Ionic capitals, the close-up of those Coromandel screens, and a Schutze sketch, interior sketch. And you can see he's actually included. You can make out the fact that that is that tossed seascape. Looking into the morning room on the right and the library on the left. The library again picks up on the red and the gold aspect and the warm tones of the brown, very much a Mrs. Wood design. And again, the red sofa, such as the original plans. The overmantel, which is 17th century, came from the Annesley Park home. It had been acquired in England. A Dutch tall case clock in the corner. These photographs of Mrs. Inman, Mr. Inman, as well as some of his racing trophies. He raced cars. He had the first driver's license in Atlanta, and I won't have time to include it here, but he had a 6-car garage built on the property. And just to show you again some details of the rooms, these are parts of the room that when you visit the house are off limits to the public. You might be able to see the runner on the far side of the room and the low stanchion. And I actually, when I realized, I've been at the Atlanta History Center a long time, and I realized this is the first time I've ever stood behind Mr. Inman's desk. So in taking these photographs, you all let me get to places where I've never been. Every room has a swan, and this is on tea caddy on his desk. The clock was inherited from his father, Mr. Inman's father. His mother removed the figures from the top because she thought they were inappropriate. Father Time. None of the portraits that are in the house are of family members. They were all acquired to give the aspect of an English country home interior. Interesting aspect of this particular is that on top is Sir John Van Brugh, who was architect of Blenheim Palace in England. Duke of Marlborough was the person that he was the architect for, and they did not get along at all. An interesting aspect is that the person who's below is his portrait of James Coombs, who worked for the Duke of Marlborough and is the one that got Van Brugh the job to begin with. So there's something interesting going on there. And if surely the Inmans and Schutze knew that that was the story behind these. Mr. Inman had a terrestrial and a celestial globe. This is Inman again, Mr. Inman. And the color even appears, the color scheme of red and gold is very apparent in the room. All the carving around the doors is hand done and was designed by Schutze, inspired by the carving that was over the mantle. The mantle itself is from the Annesley Park home, and even the rug, the Axminster rug, picks up on the color scheme, as well as the books that are on the shelves. Textiles that are on the seating, all picks up on the color scheme. This is the view outside of the library to the retaining wall in the garden. Again, Mr. Inman's trophies. This is the fabric that's on the sofa. Now, the morning room is, the family called it the green room. It's where you get Ruby Ross Wood's color. It's a bit of a shock to people when they come into it, and I'm not sure how well it can be represented here. Again, Schutze's original plans for the room. Here is where the swan appears in this room. Again, we think that the inspiration for this came from the Swan Tables, which are in the dining room, and you'll see shortly. But there you see the carving, all hand carved, these capitals, which includes the swans in the motif. Again, these are not family members. These are English portraits merely to give a feeling to the room. Mrs. Inman had a fur coat that was lost in the fire of the Ansley Park House. Her husband gave her money, as it were, to go to New York and buy a new fur. And she came back with these portraits. They are the family in England. She got another fur later on, I'll tell you that. So she had a porcelain collection herself. This is a three-tiered serving piece. And the pieces that are on it are the only ones we have left from it. There she is in a portrait. The use of chintz, the lamp. This is actually a replacement chintz, but it's very similar to what was on the sofa originally. And just again, just sharing some shots of them, some things that most people can't get up close to, right? So I just want to be able to share some of that. Probably the most shocking thing about this room, and the house was restored not quite 20 years ago, and a complete paint analysis was done at that point in time. This room had been a very pale bluish green for a number of years, but when the paint analysis came back, it was a much darker green, bolder green. And these elements, the modillions and the part of this frieze around the edge of the cove ceiling in the room are actually a light beige color. But during certain light during the day, they really look pink, and it is very disconcerting to see that today. We think that this is the original color of this room as selected by Ruby Ross Wood and Mrs. Inman. Schutze later on said to one of his employees at the firm, "We made a mistake by going with period colors." And my personal take on that is the hand decoder room that we were looking at earlier that had the swan paintings, that had a dark green that was in it. And it may be that is what this was trying to emulate. But at some point, the room was repainted. Door leading out to the boxwood porch. Such a design for the gadrooning around the windows. Looking out into the stair hall. The drapes in here have been replaced, but are very close to what was originally there. Here you really see that impact of that sort of like two-tone color that was originally in the room. The coloration in this room is very much green and gold. and a splash of red, which seems to be a ruby rosewood thing. The dining room, it's chinoiserie paper, but it's actually English, painted in a Chinese manner, and actually dates from the early 1920s and was acquired in England. This harkens back to one of the quotes I had on ruby rosewood earlier in regard to the bold wallpaper and how you match that. And so she finally used this plaid taffeta fabric for that. And I wanted to share a quote. And this is in regards to her, to an article she was writing about her own house, Little Ipswich. And she was writing about needing to make a selection for a Chinese wallpaper that she had in her own house. The story of the curtains of this passage is a long one. I wonder if I dare go into it here. There are two French windows opening into the paved court. Again, she's talking about her own house. And finding curtains that would go with the wallpaper was difficult. Suddenly, I remembered a checkered silk I'd seen in London and decided to use it. It is made up of enormous checks running through all the shades of all the colors. I wrote and ordered it, and in the meantime, our house not being finished, used it in a house in Atlanta in a room of Chinese wallpaper. It was a great success. I ordered more for my windows and it didn't come. They could no longer get it. I knew it must have been made in Paris, so I wrote a friend to find it for me. She took the sample to the silk makers, and finally an irate man told her it had come from him. Are you the mad woman who's been ordering that silk? It's not. It is simply our sample length of taffeta colors and was never meant to be made by the yard. He was finally persuaded to make another lot of it, the whole of which I had to buy. So it's interesting what that is. There's enough of it that Mimi, when she was a teenager, could have a dress made out of it. So this is actually a copy that was done by Scalamandre in the 1950s. And a tragedy of that is the fact that they had faded. So this is a faded aspect of what they originally were. This is the breakfast porch, which leads off of the dining room. Mrs. Inman used a bookcase to display her china. Just sharing some of the decorative aspects again. The Swan Tables, which are early 1700s. They acquired these from Andrew Dando in Bath in 1924. And this is the inspiration, we think, for the whole aspect of the different swans. In combination with working with Ruby Ross Wood, who had her own swans at her house. Close up of the taffeta curtains. Details of wallpaper. Sarah, did we have the Audubon Society identify and count those birds?
They said they were fantastical beasts, not real birds.
Aubusson rug, which again, picked up on the colors as well as the inspiration of William Kent for the house. The ceiling. And you can see here, we joke ourselves about Schutze sometimes because of his need for symmetry. So you can see that the doorway leads out to the hallway on the left. A fake door on the right is actually storage. the view from the dining room. Schutze designed the balances for the curtains. These pick up on the swan tables and include cattails and other elements that are in the tables. I think it's probably a better picture when the light comes through those drapes. And I wanted to include this one because it shows that dining room table at its full length. I think there are something like 12 leaves altogether. He actually had a bit of an argument with Mrs. Inman. She kept the table that was from the Annesley Park House, and he kept telling her that it was too small and not the right size, but she kept what she wanted. Again, this is the dining room table that was at the Annesley Park home. That's a Meissen piece, or it's German, it's not Meissen, it's a German piece that was on that table in that early Tebsnell photo. And these are a series of plans of the Schutze plan, sketching out the design for the dining room. I'm not quite sure if that's him standing in the window or not. This screen was originally in the room. We don't keep it in there now because of the pattern for visitors who are coming to the to Swan House, but it was also in the Annesley Park home. Again, a shot that simply shows the table set for a dinner with a few of the leaves that are in it. And I have probably gone on too long, so. And I apologize for that because Mrs. Inman's bedroom is the last one. So I'll skip through this very quickly. How's that? Its copy, this is a Brunswick and Fee copy of the original wallpaper. Door on the right leads to the bathroom, and so let me skip through. Let me skip through so we can get to the bathroom. How's that? Because that's the bathroom. With its swan ceiling. The huge overhead. All the bathrooms have, that's the toe tester to test the water temperature of the water before you turn on the shower. The wicker toilet. Of the swan capital that's in the closets, and so those are her closets, and that's the back of the door for vanity, and that's a widescreen view. And we finished where we started with the garden facade. So, Sarah, I hope you're better at. I hope the widescreen going on was.
I will take you for a quick trot through the gardens. Hope you wore comfy shoes. And let me share my screen. Do you have the correct image on your screen? Swan House Gardens title slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. So you just saw the after. Here's the before. This is the 1933 photograph from Tebsnell. And as you can see, the house is set far from the road. This is where you would drive through the gates and enter this grand estate. So the house on the hill like this is very Italianate. There was an enormous amount of land that must have moved around in order for them to build this. Now, Buckhead is a hilly residential area, but still to create these degrees of terraces and leveling, it must have been a lot of earth moving. The one thing you can see here, if you look closely, are some obelisks that are tucked into the hedges. And I saw in one of Michael's photographs, those hedges are Elaeagnus or thorny olive, and they were allowed to just grow the way that they would if you saw them on the side of the highway, which is really where they belong. And they just have these flamboyant long branches that are really exuberant and spilling over everywhere. And by the time the History Center acquired this estate, that Elaeagnus had become so overgrown, it was actually 20 feet up into the trees. And one of the earlier renovations here was to cut all of that back. Well, there's no stopping Elaeagnus, it's going to spring right back, but you can see how overgrown it is in these pictures. Also, on that retaining wall that's in the very front of that first terrace, that's English ivy. And the ivy had been allowed to run all over after the late years of Miss Inman's life, and it was climbing over the walls and everywhere. So it was difficult to control and eradicate, and something we still deal with today, but it doesn't look like this anymore. But this shows that exuberant Baroque, curvilinear, Italianate style that Schutze so loved. And then the brilliant part of this design, one of my favorite features, is that the driveway, as you saw in the large drawing in black and white that Michael showed you, the driveway curves off to the left here and through the woods. This is a more modern photograph and shows you those stone arches and rows of Belinda cascading over the top. There's the roses and the ivy clipped like it was meant to be inside those walls. And then the rose on the obelisk is Paul's climbing scarlet. And the Elaeagnus hedge behind it is trimmed down to 6 feet now, but that requires trimming every month. And so there's just another view, and it shows this is the ramp up to the second level. So that first level is a huge lawn with 2 quatrefoil fountains. Then it ramps up to this second level where we have a lot of events. And then there's the staircase and the cascade fountain that goes up to the top level. And there you can see another rose. This is the theme here. There's not many flowering plants in this very masculine landscape, but Mrs. Inman got her roses in. And so these are the New Dawn roses here on the sides. And once the Elaeagnus was held into place, then these roses could flourish. But before, and in Michael's photographs, it shows it just spilling over the walls and into the lawn. So it really needs tight reining in. So I just show this picture because after you have that beautiful view of the house from the street and this iconic view for Atlanta, then you go through the driveway and you slide up the side, you go through the woods, and there are towering oaks, hickories, and pines in these woods dotted along the way with dogwoods and redbuds. And then you get to the top where you're going to turn right into the motor court. And there's the gas lantern and then this gorgeous rhododendron catabiense. We believe this is Roseum elegans, which of course is a very old cultivar. It was introduced in 1851 by Anthony Waterer. And then you get to the beautiful side. I always want to say the front of the house, but it's not. It's just the main entrance. That blue door is behind one of those columns. And up here we have, you can see that portico advances into that lawn, and the lawn was an oval shape. And Michael's favorite tree on the entire campus was this pine tree inside that oval lawn. And we took it down and we've never heard the end of it. But that pine was going to fall in the house. So we had to take it down. And neither Michael has forgiven us nor the lawn. It just won't grow there. So
you have to explain why it's for a reason.
I think What's so interesting though is in that motor court drawing that he showed, it shows this pine tree on those plans, and it also shows 2 oaks. So Schutze, who's so famous for his symmetry, which is classic country place era kind of movement, is these oaks and this pine had no symmetry to them at all. And it makes me think more of how he wanted to age this estate instantly. And we see that throughout the landscape and in the home with their period pieces. So you have trees that maybe they look like they sprung up after the house was built and were allowed to stay. Let's carry on here. If you look on the other side, you get those ivy niches that we saw before, and another rose. This is American pillar that was allowed to grow up here. Now, this is a very strange combination that I do not recommend. First of all, I never recommend English ivy because it's horribly invasive, but ivy likes the shade and roses like the sun. And so that makes this terribly difficult to do well. The ivy is shaded a bit by the niches, but as this campus has aged and the tree canopy has aged around it, those roses are getting really heavily shaded out. So that's a difficult thing to grow. And the English ivy really gave us a run for our money one day when right before a very big and very expensive wedding, the left ivy niche just collapsed. The ivy collapsed. It just fell over. And so there was one horticulturist on the site that Saturday, and she ran over there and tried to pin it up, and it wasn't going to happen. So she had to cut the whole thing down, or else it was just going to be laying on the ground. So she clipped all 3 of them down to the base, and we could let them grow back up. But actually, we think that the ivy was allowed to grow up there by Mrs. Inman, and it was not part of Schutze's original plans, because in his other properties, those niches are always empty. So some research to do there, but I think they probably are best suited empty. That's just a shot of it in the fall, because I think it's absolutely gorgeous in the fall. You don't get a lot of color in this garden. It's primarily an evergreen landscape. And the fall, I always think of it as like a second spring. It gives you this wash of color through the trees against this very evergreen landscape, which is an excellent time of year to visit. And then there's the yuccas in these urns. I don't know where he got that from. I've never seen anyone plant yuccas in urns before, but that is a Schutze thing. So this gorgeous drawing by Schutze was what was supposed to be behind those walls. And Michael showed you how the house was going to be huge and grand with 4 statues on the top. And this beautiful round gazebo with these recumbent sphinxes in the front was part of his plan that was never realized. This was also a bit too grand, I think, for the Inmans. And so it didn't get built. And so years afterwards, many years after it became part of the History Center property, a gravel demilune was put in up there. And this is now called the Robinson Garden in honor of the Robinsons when they passed by their children. And it's full of native azaleas and rhododendron and other things that would have been characteristic of the site, and designed by Spencer Tunnell, who did a lot of research and restoration work on this one house. And there's those urns, and that stuff on the urns is tufa, and it looks like lava in real life. And once a piece broke off, and I have it in my office, it's a paperweight on my desk now. Michael, if you want it back. And then there's that ivy going mad throughout the garden. And here again is another one of these Italian axes. So you can see, you could walk into the Boxwood Garden, you have the water feature at the center, and then actually you go through the other way out to what we call Swan Woods, which is a 10-acre Piedmont woodland that is alongside Swan House. Here's another 1933 photograph. And what we think he did, because again, this is instant garden. In 1933, they finished building a house in 1928. Boxwood don't get this big that fast. So he did not go to some nursery and buy humongous boxwood. I think he went knocking on doors and asking people if he could buy their huge boxwood, because that was not unusual at the time. And people still do that. So this garden and the selection of species that he chose for this landscape, almost all of them are fast growing plants, except for boxwood. So he would have had to source some really huge ones to make them look like this. But the other species in this garden, much to the horticulturist's chagrin, are liriope, wisteria, and running bamboo. So all very difficult to maintain, fast growing plants. In mimosa, you can see the leaves right here. This is the garden today. It went through a renovation in 1995. As when it became a public garden, certain things had to shift a little bit. And then one thing was that this garden was having some issue with drainage, and they put gravel crusher run across the paths that used to be crushed limestone. And it got built up so much over the time that drainage got worse and worse. And eventually it had to be renovated. And when they dug it out, they found these old clay tiles that were edging the beds. And they found the path between the boxwood and the liriope and English ivy there. And in the corners in those beds are standard wisteria. This is a white Wisteria floribunda alba. And I've yet to see them flower, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. And also this photo is from a company the company we bought the gravel from. And they were so proud to have their gravel at Swan House. They sent a professional photographer to take pictures so that they could show people. And here we're kind of zooming in on the beautiful statuary at the end of the garden, these Ionic columns supporting the broken pediment, the eagle and the urns and the stone bench. This is all the types of things that Schutze was borrowing from his visits around Italy and England. And everybody who was anybody had statuary in their gardens at this period. So this had to be replicated and make the garden look old, just like the tufa on the urns makes them look old. The bamboo at the back of the garden, rapid growing, filled in this whole space quickly. And then it filled the 5 acres behind it, which we dealt with when we became owners of the property. So if you walked over to that statue and you turned around and looked back at the boxwood porch, this would be the view that you would see. And the boxwood that you saw originally that were so billowy and full, all of those had to be removed during the renovation. Many of them were also failing. That was Buxus sempervirens and Safruticosa. And it doesn't do well for us in these particular conditions because the drainage is pretty bad. And so it was renovated, and then all of those boxwoods were replaced with a Korean boxwood called Justin Brower's, which stays fairly small. And this actually looks a bit more like the drawing that we had from him, his blueprint drawing. Now this picture here, you can see that crepe myrtle that looks a little bit crooked. That's called phototropic lean. And the reason it's shifted over to the right is because of that gigantic magnolia on the left. So we actually got a grant from the Garden Conservancy in 2015 to remove 5 huge Magnolia grandifloras that were surrounding the garden. These were not planted by Schutze's crew or anything. They were self-sown by birds, quite a problem around the Atlanta area. And all of them had grown so large that they had shaded out the wisteria, which is why they weren't flowering. The peonies that are lining the perennial beds of this garden, that's why they weren't flowering. And these crepe myrtles, which only flower on the side inside the garden. So in this plan view, that shows the boxwood porch on the left and a house on the left, and then the whole of the boxwood garden. In this plan, the magnolias were on both the top and the bottom of this drawing alongside the wall, and they were within 1 foot of the wall. In some cases, were 3 to 5 feet in other cases. So they had made the garden feel quite gloomy. So when we got the grant, we were able to take those magnolia out, allow some light in, do some corrective pruning on the crepe myrtles, and hopefully we'll get our wisteria to bloom. So that's us protecting those urns before any big tree limbs came down. And these were huge. As you leave the boxwood garden, you can go a couple different ways. You can go towards this elephant, Ambrose the elephant, who is in a stone circle down this walkway, or you can exit to the right and go to the front of the Swan House with the Cascade Fountain. And what you can see here is a before picture. One of these red buds is dead, the big right one on the right, and then there's the other smaller ones. And when we were doing this project with the magnolias, we raked all of this out. And part of our situation with the city of Atlanta is we have to permit these trees for removal and replace them with other native species. So we thought, well, we'll replace the missing red bud down this LA. And it turned out when we were raking all of this out and taking out the dead ones, that we found stumps with a bit of garden archaeology all the way around that stone circle. And that meant that we actually could interpret this more accurately to what Schutze had originally designed, which was to have the red butternut go down the path and then around the circle at the end. And we found a stone retaining wall at the end as well, which was very deeply buried. So that was cool. This is what that looks like now. There's more light in the garden. The red buds are beautiful in spring. The blue scillas, or Hyacinthioides hispanica, the blue Spanish bluebells, run down the length of this, as well as summer snowflake or leucojum. And it's absolutely gorgeous in spring. So that's where our big push for spring bloom. And then in the late spring, early summer, we get the roses going into full flower. And then if you stood down at that stone circle and looked back up towards the house, this is the view that you would get. So I think there's two great things here that Schutze did as you tour around the house in the gardens. And one is that driveway where you get this flamboyant, Baroque, Italianesque look from the front, and you go through the woods as you transition to the more Palladian style on the main entrance of the house. And then as you transition around the house, you go through Boxwood Garden, which is so similar to a monastic cloister garden. And that also serves as a transition space between the Palladian and this more flamboyant Baroque side. So I think both of those speak to his genius in trying to get around the house and transition from one space into another. And this is the view out of the ox-eye window, the round window at the top of Swan House, looking back down at the Cascade lawns. And you can see those quatrefoil fountains at the very front, which they bear some religious symbolism. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John with the quatrefoils. And at the top here, you can see it's a couple of things I want to point out. One is that the stairs are wider at the base and narrower at the top. And that helps bring the eye up the Cascade fountain and the staircases, and also gives an illusion of it being a longer space than it is. And the other is those pitiful boxwoods that I'm pointing out. Those all ended up getting boxwood blight. And if you have questions about that, you can ask me in the Q&A. We replaced all of them. And they are now, you can't grow boxwood where you had boxwood before if they had blight. And so they're now all a holly that looks a lot like boxwood, trying to maintain Schutze's vision of this garden without hemming ourselves into using the exact same plants, as long as we got the look that he was going for. And this is another photograph from our gravel photographer. I put this path in because the lawn that had been here before had been worn out by visitor traffic. And as I said, we host a lot of weddings. So part of having a historic home and garden that is open to the public is making some adaptations for being open to the public. And one of those is that now Mrs. Inman just had lawn here. She had her mint julep cocktail parties out here every May with cheese straws. And this, I hope you're enjoying some. And then we just couldn't win with the lawn here with all of the traffic going back and forth visiting the Swan House. So we put in this gravel path that I designed, and it's all based on measurements of the curves of those horseshoe stairs and the fountain itself, so that we replicate some of the same radii that you see in those other pieces of architecture. And then those are our very old boxwood, and then the Lady Banks rose. And in that very old picture I started with, that Lady Banks was allowed to go like a pencil thin mustache up over that front door and back down again. And I think it looked horrible. And thankfully, when I started at the History Center about 11 years ago, it was already gone, because I probably would have said it needs to go too. And that's that window, the round window at the top, where you can look out and see those lawns. I think it's the maid's room. Isn't that right, Michael? Wasn't that her room? I think the house servants were up on the top floor. Yeah. So as with weddings, we're also a film site, and Atlanta has become very popular for filming. And so that's also a source of revenue for us, but also a source of great trepidation for the gardens team, as we do everything we can to protect this house and garden from all the pressure that is put on it by being open to the public. Yeah, we're Yollywood. And if you want to see more of the Swan House, you can find us in the Hunger Games, Catching Fire. I think we're in Mockingjay Part 2 as well. That is the Swan House in pink and blue there. That's the magic of Hollywood for you. They did all sorts of crazy things. I was there for the filming. Best part of the whole thing was seeing Donald Sutherland walk around with curlers this big in his hair. And just checking out the campus with his curlers in. It was, they had the lady who played Effie, her trailer was right in front of our building door, and we could only get our door open 45 degrees and squeeze in and out. It was a lot of fun though. We stayed overnight. Hair and makeup people were everywhere. And they put down a gravel path that we ripped out. And so there was just a lot of work that went into the stairs that went up the front retaining wall that were made of styrofoam that we took out later. But they looked like stone. So anyway, it was a lot of fun, but this is just part of having a public garden and a historic house museum that's open and doing these sorts of things to figure out, problem solve our way through what we can do and what we can't allow, and then how we do preventative damage, and then how we can repair things afterwards. So that was just I just tried to make it short and run through that pretty quickly, but I'm happy to take any of your questions. I'm very, very grateful that you included us in your series this year. It's wonderful. I can't wait to watch more of these as you keep them going.
Thank you so much, Michael and Sarah. Does anyone have any questions here? I don't see any in the virtual. You covered so much so well. I guess that's why there aren't any questions. Anyone in the live audience have questions? Wow, you covered everything so well.
Well, we promised we.
No, I thought it was a question. It was someone saying thank you. Ah, wonderful. Oh, wait, there is a question. What do you do with the healthy plants and trees that you remove?
We don't usually remove healthy ones, but we had, if we do, we just relocate them, usually elsewhere on campus. But the boxwood that had blight had to be removed and double bagged and thrown in dumpsters. And there was quite a protocol that we all had hazmat suits on, so we didn't spread it to any of the existing boxwood. I'm trying to think of what other plant I might have alluded to that was removed. We pruned the rose. It didn't get removed. It just got pruned.
Well, if there are no other questions.
Well, thank you all for joining us. It was a wonderful trip through Atlanta and through history. It was fun seeing the early Atlanta shots as the city was emerging. I want to thank you all for joining us, both in Zoom land and in person. And I look forward next week, see you at the circus with the Ringlings. So thank you all.